Yeah, there's a lot of road noise outside my place. I just want to switch to
You're
headphones.
live.
Just want
You're
to do a
live.
sound.
Hello and welcome to tonight's event at the Berkeley Forum. My name is Lucy Chang, and as the president of this organization, it brings me a lot of excitement to introduce tonight's event, which is Jen Deerinwater at the Berkeley Forum. Before we get started, we like to begin all of our events with an attendance form. So please fill this out at please fill out this form at tinyurl.com/Deerinwater attendance. I'd also like to encourage everyone in the audience to submit questions at tinyurl.com/Deerinwater questions, which we will ask tonight during the event. I'd also like to begin this event with a land acknowledgement. The Berkeley Forum would like to take this time to acknowledge that our events and UC Berkeley's campus sit on the territory of the Ohlone people and that we benefit from the occupation of this land. It is important to us that we recognize this history out of respect for the Muwekma Ohlone who are still present in Berkeley and the Bay Area today. For more Native education resources on campus, we encourage you to look into the Centers of Educational Justice and Community Engagement. And with that, I'd like to pass things off to my event manager for the night, Brian Kim.
Thanks, Lucy. All right. Tonight's speaker will be Jen Deerinwater. Jen Deerinwater is a bisexual, two-spirit, multiply disabled citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and an award-winning journalist and organizer who covers the myriad of issues her community faces with an intersectional lens. Jen is the founding executive director of Crushing Colonialism and the 2019 New Economies Reporting Project and 2020 Disability Futures Fellow. Jen is a contributor at Truthout, and her work has been featured in a wide range of publications, including Rewire News, In These Times, and more. Jen's writing also appears in Disability Visibility, First-Person Stories from the 21st Century, and the forthcoming Building Narrative Power for 21st Century Social Movements and Crip Authorship, Disability as Method. Jen is the co-editor of the anthology Sacred and Subversive, and is currently hard at work at her own book. Pictured on the right is a photo of Jen holding a medallion with the words Crushing Colonialism inscribed on it. Without further ado, I would like to invite to the virtual stage for her opening remarks, Jen Deerinwater.
OCO, hello. It's so nice to be here with all of you. I'd like to start with the accessibility practice of giving an image description of myself for those who may not be able to see me. I am a white-coated native femme. I have long brown wavy hair that I'm wearing down. I am wearing black glasses and bright purple lipstick with black, purple, and yellow native beaded earrings. And I'm wearing a white shirt, and you can just barely see where it says in bold white lettering, "Demand climate justice." And behind me is my little office nook and my kitchen. So I started Crushing Colonialism in 2016 during the No DAPL movement at Standing Rock Sioux Indian Reservation in North Dakota. So for those who may not know, this was the Indigenous-led resistance movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline that has caused direct harm to Native people along the path of the pipeline. So my original plan when I started Crushing Colonialism was to be an independent Indigenous news site that was entirely Indigenous controlled and created content. Unfortunately, our publisher ran out of money and the publication had to be given up on before it even began. But I wasn't ready to give up on the idea of an Indigenous organization rooted in decolonial storytelling. Storytelling is a traditional Indigenous way, and journalism is a part of this. My people created and sustained, despite genocide and removals, the first Native newspaper. The Cherokee Phoenix celebrated its 194th anniversary this year. I thought about my experiences in media and other professional spaces. I thought about the supports I needed to receive as a multiply marginalized journalist. I looked towards existing professional organizations and didn't see what I needed. I didn't see myself reflected there at all. There was an absence of some part of myself, no two spirits present, no disability access, cis men and white people dominating spaces, and so on. How was I ever going to succeed in an industry that I wasn't welcome in? How did the majority of Indigenous, disabled, or queer women or people, or any other marginalized people, do so? And the answer is that we often don't. A 2017 study by the Native American Journalists Association found that Native journalists represent just 0.2% of mainstream media employees. In fact, most mainstream media is still owned, operated, and dominated by white cis men, despite being in majority minority cities. Staff at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are both 81% white. The Wall Street Journal's overall percentage of minority employees only budged a mere 2% between 2001 and 2017, and only 4% among leaders. The Washington Post staff is 70% white, and ethnic and racialized minoritized people make up 72% of the population of Los Angeles, but are only 33% of the staff at the Los Angeles Times. You know, things don't get much better when we look at who works in media along gender and sexuality. Pay gaps persist along gender lines in newsrooms at the Associated Press, the Los Angeles and New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, with men earning substantially more than women. And when it comes to gender and age, however, younger newsroom employees do look like the rest of US employees overall on gender breakdown. So there is some good news there. Newsroom employees ages 18 to 29 are just as likely as workers overall to be men, which is 51% in both groups. Now, among older workers, it's different. Newsroom employees are disproportionately cis men. About 2/3 of newsroom employees ages 30 and older are men, compared with a little over half of all US workers. This also means that senior staff, editors, and other influential and decision-making staff are overwhelmingly cis men. The people making the decisions on the stories that are told and how they are told are being made primarily by white cis men. You know, I can't even find data on the numbers of queer journalists. There doesn't seem to have been any sort of study done looking at how many queer people work in journalism. You know, when I occasionally Google the term two-spirit and two-spirit journalists just to see what comes up, and I did it today, and the first thing that popped up was a style guide by NLGJA, which is the Association of LGBTQ Journalists, and it only provided this very incomplete definition of what two-spirit means. I'm also one of the only two-spirit journalists that comes up when you Google two-spirit journalists. And it's been that way for some time, and I don't want it to be that way. You know, there are also no statistics on disabled journalists. Once again, no one has bothered to count us in our role in journalism. We also have no professional societies nor supports. You know, the few of us who are publicly out as disabled are primarily freelance, and those on staff have little to no real power. You know, I will say, though, that there has been some work behind the scenes to finally begin a disabled journalist professional organization. You know, there are some things being done. There's a disabled writers list that exists. So there are some things that we're doing for ourselves, but we don't have what we need, unfortunately. You know, we should take into account the many barriers that keep people out of media. For example, it wasn't until June 2020 when SCOTUS ruled it illegal to fire someone based on their sexuality or gender identity. Before that, I could legally be fired in 26 states. The Americans with Disability Act that prevents some discrimination based on disability in the workplace, but it has no enforcement body, so there's no one to oversee it. And for many journalists like myself who are freelance, it's not applicable because we're not employees. The majority of freelance journalists actually are Indigenous or Black or Brown. We're more likely to be women, more likely to be queer or disabled or marginalized in some other way. Being a freelance reporter also means, you know, we lack a steady paycheck, benefits, and financial and legal supports for our work. Any expenses related to a story are our burden to carry. If we are arrested or injured while working, it's once again our burden to carry. If we're sued, you know, you get the picture. The pay that most freelancers receive is horribly low as well. You know, I've been paid as little as $25 for a piece. You know, and this leads to many of us needing grants and fellowships in order to support our work, as well as many side gigs so that we can maybe get the bills paid. Meanwhile, our visibility as minoritized journalists makes us targets for violence or suppression by the state, corporate, or individual actors. Roughly half of women journalists from 50 countries, including the US, who were surveyed by the International Federation of Journalists, said that they had faced a range of physical and verbal abuse in the course of their work. I've received a great deal of hate mail over the years that has included rape and death threats. I've had police pointing guns at me. I've been gassed and threatened with arrest numerous times. I've had my career as a journalist used against me in court even. While attempting to get a protection order renewed against a man who had raped me, I was accused by the defense of going to court to, quote, further my career, rather than the fact that I was trying to keep myself as safe as possible from a man who had a really lengthy criminal history of domestic abuse and other, forms of assault. As a result of that instance, I halted most of my work on sexual assault and on murdered and missing Indigenous women until that case was finally closed. It took a little over 3 years for that criminal case to close. I'm only just now returning to my work on these topics. The ways in which people like me are kept from being in media and being an active part of journalism are vast and varied. State suppression, which is, I just gave one example that I have gone through. I want to bring up my good friend Lee Camp and what has recently happened to him. So Lee had a very popular show called Redacted Tonight that was on RT America. So Redacted Tonight was comedy and news. It was like if The Daily Show had any guts. However, RT America is Russian owned, and over the years, it just became harder for them to operate in the US. And with the recent sanctions, they closed. So during Lee's career, he's been ardently anti-war. He's held the US government and mainstream media accountable in numerous ways. And so he recently, as a result of RT America closing, he went freelance. And as so many journalists and creatives have to do, he turned to Patreon. And once he began to get traction there, mainstream media outlets started putting out hit pieces on him. Meanwhile, Lee is a white, hetero, able-bodied cis man, and this is how he's treated for accurately reporting truths that the powers that be would rather see hidden. Journalists like me almost never even get a show to lose to state suppression. But even if you get there, if you don't toe the party line, your job is taken from you like that. There's just so many forms of discrimination at play that keep multiply marginalized journalists from having long-lasting, well-paid careers or any career at all. The ableism in journalistic spaces, including those that are even ran by other oppressed people, is often just blatant. They don't offer the most basic of disability accommodations, let alone the career supports that disabled journalists may require. Also, we shouldn't have to out ourselves as disabled in order to gain disability access and supports. Many of us hide our disabilities out of a fear of discrimination in the workplace or even for our own safety. It's also a highly personal matter that some of us don't want to have to discuss in a work setting. And bringing up our access needs doesn't always end well. This fellowship I'm about to describe is not the 2 fellowships that are listed in my bio earlier. So I just wanted to make that clear. This is a fellowship that I do not publicly share, but I want to tell my story of what happened in it. So I held this journalism fellowship a few years ago. That was probably one of the worst professional experiences of my life. And that's saying something because I worked in politics for years. And before that, I originally went to school to study music and had planned to work in the music industry. So I've been in some very toxic professional and educational spaces, but this is still probably one of the worst. So the required in-person training wasn't accessible for me. So I suffered higher rates of pain and exhaustion, but I didn't really feel comfortable speaking up. So I just kind of kept quiet until things just kept getting worse and worse. So the second optional but encouraged in-person meeting that they had planned wasn't accessible at all. Despite knowing that they had a disabled fellow, the organization, they didn't bother to ensure accessibility for the event they were bringing us all to. So I could not go. Everyone else could go, but I couldn't. I was also the only Native fellow, as they didn't do any outreach to Native journalists. When I finally brought this all up to them and tried to explain why I was upset and how these various things that had happened were discrimination, I was met with a great deal of hostility. First, they froze my funds. So I was supposed to have some money coming in towards expenses on the reporting project I was working on, and they froze them. They decided to put them on hold. And then they repeatedly encouraged me to quit. But I didn't want to quit. I wanted to see the fellowship through. I also wanted it to be a space where disabled and Native people would be comfortable and safe and supported and loved in the future. I didn't want to just leave. I wanted to fix the problem, but they were not invested in fixing that problem. When I wouldn't quit, they eventually just told everyone in the program that I had quit. And they even instructed some people not to speak to me. And the sad thing is that particular fellowship was created primarily by queer women and people of color. And that was still my experience in it as a disabled person and as a Native. And this is just one of the many experiences I've suffered. I've had to deal with the indignities of being told I wouldn't be provided in mentors in educational and professional programs that were providing mentors to others. And the reason was always the same. They didn't have anyone like me to mentor me. There weren't any other Native or disabled people. Or years ago when I was younger, there weren't any openly bisexual or queer people. I'm very thankful that last one has at least gotten better. So it was all of this and so much more that led me to start crushing colonialism. And that led me to decide I have to keep this going. Maybe we can't be an independent publication, but we can do something. And so, my communities are vast and diverse. So our needs are vast and diverse. And crushing colonialism is meant to support Indigenous multimedia makers in developing and sustaining our work in order to tell our stories for ourselves as we're the experts on our lives. We don't need non-Native reporters at the New York Times telling our stories and doing it inaccurately and disrespectfully. We're the ones that should be doing this, and so that's the thought with crushing colonialism. And we've accomplished in just our few years, we've accomplished a lot with very little. In 2020 alone, we held 9 virtual events that included everything from a COVID-19 journalism roundtable to talks on environmental and reproductive justice. On a budget of less than $20,000, we had ASL and live captioning for 6 out of the 9 events. And we offered Spanish and English translation and live captioning for 5 of those 9 events. We paid our speakers. Not as much as I would have liked to have done, but they got paid because I believe in people being paid for their work. And we did all of this because the inclusion of all of our people matters. We've also been doing work to bridge the digital divide that is so pervasive in this country. Many Native people in our more rural lands and our reservations in villages don't have the telecommunications infrastructure. They may not be able to have cell phone service or to have internet. And many of our people are actually urban based. 71% of those of us who are categorized as American Indian and Alaskan Native live in urban or suburban areas. And while there will be telecommunications infrastructure there, because so many of our people live in such dire poverty, they still don't have access to it because there is no money to pay for internet every month or a cell phone or to afford the latest gadgets that you need to access whatever apps or programs or such. So this digital divide, it's so pervasive, and it's been particularly bad for us during COVID-19. COVID hit our communities so hard, and then so much of the response to keep people safe was to say, well, do everything online. Well, our community suffered, multiple ways. And so that really got me to thinking, what can Crushing Colonialism do to further make our work inclusive for all of our people? And so one of the things that we're just beginning to work on is we're going to create and release both a digital and a hard copy zine called For the Relatives. And the content is going to be by Indigenous people on disability, disability justice, health, COVID-19, and other related topics. The online version will include content that provides access across disabilities, both to those who are providing the content and to those who are watching it and consuming it. We'll have hard copies of the zine for sale. We're going to do a sliding scale with an option to, check to buy a zine for someone else. But we're also going to put some hard copy zines aside, and we're going to send those for free to Native people and tribes and organizations who want them, who are living on the other side of this digital divide and aren't able to access our online content. So this is just some of the things that we're doing currently. And so my goal is also to eventually offer trainings and support spaces that not only nurture our creative talents and careers, but that nurture us as people. This work and the world we live in is often traumatic. Making oneself public, while that can be very powerful, it can also be very scary. It puts you in a very vulnerable place, and we need to have spaces where we're held and we're cared for, because while this work is joyous and I feel immensely humbled that I'm allowed to do this work and that people entrust me with their stories, it's also very painful and stressful. I have a lot of secondary trauma from doing this work, and I want Crushing Colonialism to be a space where it's not just, can we get you a job? Can we get you paid? But it's also, how are you doing today? What other supports do you need? Maybe we need to create a space for Indigenous journalists to come together and talk about the things we're going through. I don't know, these are some of the things that I'm thinking through that I would like us to do. Of course, we'll also be, offering information on internships, fellowships, grants, employment opportunities, calls for submissions, but only ones that are paid. Once again, I believe in paying people. I'd like us to eventually have our own grant fund as well, so that we can help redistribute foundation wealth from the hands of primarily white people to Indigenous people. Grant applications are often long, they're difficult, and a lot of them are very disability inaccessible. They take a great amount of time, and I want us to have a grant fund that's actually really useful for our relatives who need it most. I want a grant fund that is applicable to what we need, as opposed to us trying to fit into someone else's boxes of what they think we need. There's just so much that I hope to accomplish, and in doing this work, we as Indigenous people are able to control our own narratives in order to crush colonialism and create a just world with tribal sovereignty. So, Wado, thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much for that address. Before I start, I'd like to invite the audience to fill out the questions form in the description if they haven't done so already. We will be asking a handful of questions from this forum at the end of the event. Thank you so much, Jen, for being here today. We're so excited to have you. So Jen, for my first question of the evening, I'd like to ask about your personal approach to the media that you put out. You regularly write on topics that are personal to you. For instance, you have written about the experience of being multiply disabled and two-spirited in the anthologies Disability, Visibility, and Two Spirits Belong Here. How has writing about such personal topics in your career impacted your relationship with these identities?
I'd say that's a really good question. I don't think I've had anyone ask me that question before. I would say it's impacted my identity and my relationship to my communities in both positive and negative ways. Some of the positive are that, I get to talk about the things that our communities need to have talked about. And I use part of my own personal experiences in life to go, well, hey, wait, if I'm having problems getting a home health aide, what's it like for other disabled people? I look at the things that maybe others from outside my community aren't going to see or necessarily know to look for. So in that way, it's been really positive, and it has been in some ways liberating to be able to take these parts of myself that I've been told that I'm supposed to be ashamed of and that I'm supposed to hide. And instead, I'm able to just really put it out there big and loud and bold and talk about it all. Now, on the flip side of that, it has created some tensions within community. I talk about issues and take a stance on issues that people don't always agree with. And, that's okay. I don't need everyone to agree with me all the time, and not everyone is going to like me. That's okay. But that has created some difficulties at times. There are also, I think too, there have been some moments in time where I think some folks don't understand the difference between a journalist and a publicist as well. And that has created some issues where I've had to say, like, listen, I'm here to tell a story and tell it truthfully with the important nuances, but I'm not here to give you good press necessarily. I'm not here to give you bad press, but, so yeah, there's, which I think is a learning opportunity for me and for community. I hope I answered that question.
No, that was an amazing insight into the sort of process you used to engage on your disability advocacy. To further talk about this thread about disability advocacy, in your Truth op-ed, you referenced data suggesting that rates of disability are as high as 50% in the Indigenous community, significantly higher than the average of 15%. COVID-19 mortality was also highest among Indigenous populations. How, if at all, are past and present colonial structures manifested in the poor health infrastructure afforded to Indigenous communities?
We don't have anywhere near enough time for me to answer that properly. Well, I mean, it's impacted us in a variety of ways. Everything from taking away our ancestral knowledge, the access to our ancestral lands, plants, medicine surroundings that were part of traditional forms of healthcare and spiritual wellness and being. We're forced into places that are polluted. We have our water taken from us, rerouted through dams or such. The climate crisis is impacting us so heavily. So there's a number of ways in which colonialism is impacting our health and causing these incredibly higher rates of chronic illnesses and disabilities. In that particular article, I was looking at indigeneity and disability on a global level. But it really was any country I looked where I could find statistics. It was just the data just kept coming back that the rates of disability or chronic illnesses in Indigenous communities were just higher than everyone else. And part of that is the lack of healthcare as well. So, you have colonization bringing in diseases and things. We're being killed, we're being traumatized, we're having our traditional ways taken from us. And then we have Western medicine given to us, but it's only half given to us at best. Indian Health Services, which is it's a federally funded and operated health service that is for those of us who are American Indians and Alaskan Natives, tribal citizens and members, and those who have proof of indigeneity. We are supposed to get this health care. This is part of a trust and treaty responsibility the United States government has to us. This is something that our ancestors negotiated for through the loss of life and land. We've already paid for this health care, but the US government doesn't fund it. That article in the Disability Visibility book that I mentioned, sorry, my cat is meowing and concerning me, but I think they're just being playful. The piece that's in Alice Wong's Disability Visibility, I talk some about how poorly funded the Indian Health Services is. It's so poorly funded that I believe it's, I don't even want to try to give the dollar amount right now, but we would need tons of money just to get IHS up to basic standards, let alone being able to provide the kind of care we need. There's also a lot of ways in which we are not able to make decisions as well. Because IHS is federally funded, we're not allowed to provide abortions in IHS facilities unless it's in the case of rape or incest or to save the life of the pregnant person. But what if your tribal nation wants to provide abortions? You should be able to. It's on your sovereign land. That is your right, but we're not able to do that in IHS. There's just so many ways that they keep our hands tied that makes us sick, makes us disabled, and makes it worse and worse. I've kind of thought about this as a disabled person lately, thinking about the way the capitalistic system chews us up as workers. It just slowly kills us, just expanding our labor and our skill and our being through, work over the years until you eventually just die from it. And then for me, as somebody who is not able to be a full-time worker for, however many years, I am instead just kind of being used up through the medical system. It's kind of we'll barely keep this person alive just so we can keep making money off of them. So I often feel that way. I do think, though, for Native community, the US government's approach is more of well, let's just not give them anything and they'll die, which is what we saw happen with COVID-19.
Well, thank you for distilling that as best you could, the huge question. So people often think that the way out of these oppressive structures is via politics, via actions that happen in the public sphere, like marches and protests, such as at the Dakota Access Pipeline. However, those with disabilities are often excluded from these kinds of politics, raising concerns about ableism within direct action organizing spaces. In what other ways can society work towards breaking barriers that people with disabilities encounter to make their voices heard? Could storytelling serve as a path towards a more accessible politics?
I think it's one important part, but it's certainly not enough. I think visibility, storytelling, it's all very important. It's very powerful, education, but that is never going to be enough to get oppressive systems changed, or to just do away with an oppressive system. And that's where I think direct action is really crucial in a number of ways. I mean, the climate crisis is a great example. You can't expect the system that is responsible for the climate crisis to undo the climate crisis. It's Audre Lorde's quote, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And that's, for me, part of why direct action is so important. We can't look to the government. We can't look to these leaders to save us. These are the people that are harming us in any number of ways. And I say that across all the parties. When I was much younger, I was a hardcore Democrat. I mean, I was kind of obnoxious about it, to be honest. But I grew up in rural Oklahoma and Texas. For me, I looked around and everything that I saw that felt wrong was being done by Republicans. So in my head, I thought, well, the Democrats must be the good guys. I grew up, left home, lived on the West and the East Coast, and realized, oh, yeah, there's lots of problems here too. And then I worked for the Democrats and went, yeah, no, these aren't the good guys either. They look better in front of a camera, but these aren't the people that are going to help us. And there are many problems in direct action spaces, in movement spaces: sexism, racism, anti-Blackness, colonialism, ableism. Like, there's all the problems that we have in society, we have in direct action spaces, we have in movement spaces, because despite the fact that you do have people coming together that want to create change, we're also still bringing in all those years and generations of whatever crap we've been told, whether that's, something white supremacist or misogynistic. Like, we're all bringing this into these spaces. So that's also where I think something that's really important that we need to do in movement spaces is not just how do we fix what's happening, stop what's happening. It's how do we create communities where we care for one another, where we don't use each other up, which does happen a lot in direct action spaces. And that is a particular issue for those of us who are chronically ill or disabled. It's, the issue is urgent. We got to go. And so we just work each other to death until people are really sick, they're really injured, they're permanently disabled. And we have to make our communities and our spaces, not only do we need to make them accessible and have disabled people. Like, disabled people must always be one of the first people you think of, just like you need to look around and say, do I have Indigenous people or Black people here, or women or whomever, if the space is applicable to that. I'm sorry, my cats are fighting and they're distracting me. The joys of working at home. Yeah, I think I was almost done with that question. I hope that made some sense, what I was trying to convey. But, there's always a way to be a part of direct action, despite disability or chronic illness. Our roles shift over time. 1 week, someone may be able to take a more arrestable role. And then the next week they're like, hey, I can't risk an arrest. So even beyond disability, our roles within movement will change, but they're all important. The person who feeds the person who's doing a lockdown is really important. The person that's over there talking to the police and keeping the police from coming and hurting the people who are locked down, man, that person's important. Everyone is playing some kind of important role. And so I think, there's always a space for all of us. And that's also something that our people in our movement spaces need to remember, is that whether you realize it or not, there are chronically ill and disabled people in our spaces. We are here. We just need to be in spaces where we're loved and respected enough that we can be open about that, and we can have our needs met and have the needs of our communities met, and have disability justice be a part of all of our movement spaces.
That is an incredible look into what it really takes to build grassroots movements. And I'm sure this experience has come throughout years and years of starting organizations, publishing articles, and organizing for political causes. Was there anyone in particular who inspired this sort of multifaceted trajectory of your career? And who should the youth look to as they seek to embark in direct action?
I think I want to say that there are a lot of people that I've learned from over the years, some in positive and negative ways. I think sometimes we can learn the most in our losses or failures, for lack of a better word. And sometimes I've learned a lot from people that turned out to not be very inspiring. You know, I want to encourage youth to, you know, look to yourselves, look to the people around you, look to your elders and your ancestors, but also remember that people are people. We are not perfect. You know, look to people and look to the good, but learn from the bad as well. And just remember that. And in that process, hold yourself accountable as well. I don't know. I've tried to move away from the whole, this is my hero kind of person, because a lot of my heroes, as I grew up and learned more about them, they disappointed me. But I've also learned that's because, you know, you can be amazing at something and have done this really incredible thing, but in some other facet, you can be horrible, you know, and just people are people. So I guess look around, learn, be skeptical, always question. I mean, have faith and trust, but also make sure you're putting your faith and trust in the right people.
I think that's a great way to round off the sort of the questions that we had prepared for you. Now I'd like to move on to the audience Q&A portion. I'll be reading out some questions that the audience has. The first one comes from Emily. The question is, what is your take on the idea that journalism should be neutral versus speaking from your identities?
Well, first of all, no one is neutral. This idea of impartiality in journalism is completely false. There is no impartiality. I mean, BlackRock Fund owns, I believe it's 4.9% of the New York Times, you know, and BlackRock is the world's largest investment fund. You know, is the New York Times really going to be impartial around climate or war and the things that BlackRock is investing in when they're a major owner of, a significant owner of the New York Times? Like, no, they're not going to be. You know, this idea of impartiality just does not exist. And I feel like the more we push for impartiality, the more backwards it goes, because anytime we try to think of what the standard is always white and cis, a man, able-bodied, straight, English speaking, Christian. You know, there is this idea in which everything is always based on this kind of standard. And that is kind of what happens with this idea of impartiality in journalism. Instead, it ends up being set by, you know, the people who are in charge. So I don't think it's what we should be aiming for. We should be telling the truth. We should be telling stories for what they are. You know, we shouldn't be trying to sugarcoat the truth of something just because it might make someone uncomfortable. You know, guess what? Life is uncomfortable. Life is ugly and traumatic sometimes. Like, yeah, it's beautiful and wonderful as well, but the truth needs to be told. And this, I don't know, the idea of impartiality is just, it's a farce. You know, it's really a farce. I want to tell us a little story. I haven't actually told this one before publicly, but I very briefly dated someone years ago who was a writer for Fox News. I made very different decisions about who I dated back then. Please don't judge me. I'm older and wiser now. But, you know, he actually was a liberal, which also makes it, you know, kind of extra hilarious. You know, it's Fox News and here he was, you know, liberal, Democrat, all that. And he told me, it's like, you know, because I asked him, like, how can you write this stuff? Like, it's not true. How can you do this? And he told me, it's like, you know, one day at work, I really just wanted to push the envelope. I wanted to see how far I could go with just the most ridiculous lie before my bosses would be like, no, that's too much. And he told me that the bosses loved it and told him to write more like that. So, you know, and I know that's Fox News, but there are things similarly happening at MSNBC and all of them, you know? So impartiality is just, that is not a real thing. We need to use who we are and our lives and experiences to tell stories and to tell them accurately.
Wow, that was a super interesting insight into the sort of the mind of somebody who's worked so deeply in these things. It was amazing. We have another question from an anonymous source, or from an anonymous audience member. How can education systems as we know them contribute to direct action, or is colonialism too entrenched?
Well, I don't think that the educational system itself is going to provide and create and sustain direct action. However, I think that educational spaces can be a site of liberation for some, and it can be a site where we meet other people like us, where we get to meet other people that we can organize with and do direct action with. You know, it was my time as an undergrad at USC that, you know, I cut my teeth doing community organizing work. You know, it's where I got to meet other people that, you know, had similar beliefs and, you know, wanted to make things better. But do I think USC itself helped in direct action and that kind of work? God, no. Oh, God, no. Absolutely not. They never will. They are a colonial system. So I think that should always be remembered about the educational system. But there are ways that we can use these systems to further direct action and to bring justice about.
And for the sake of time, we have one more question left. And it's from Nima. It's a bit of a fun one. As an avid reader and writer, I'm curious, what have been some of your favorite reads over the years?
The Grapes of Wrath is one of them. Steinbeck is, you know, racist and sexist and all those things, but I think that book I really love. It's one that I want to reread over and over again, and each time I feel like I get something different from it. You know, I read a lot of nonfiction mostly, but it's kind of interesting that the two books that are coming to mind are both fiction right now. So Grapes of Wrath, and then There There by Tommy Orange. Amazing book. It's fiction, and it's really interesting. It's a fiction book, but he also has a nonfiction essay in it. It's just incredible. The writing is incredible. The story around urban natives in, you know, the San Francisco Bay Area, like, it's just an incredible book. And then there's tons of nonfiction writers that I love, but I know we're running out of time. If you actually look at and follow my Instagram or other social media and that of Crushing Colonialism, you know, we often share, I share, and Crushing Colonialism will share different books or films that we like, you know, things like that. So it's for Crushing Colonialism, it's all at Crushing Colonialism. You can just find us that way. You can also just find me on social media. It's Jen Deerinwater.
Great, I'll definitely be checking that out. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much for answering our questions. I'd now like to invite our president, Lucy Chang, back up to the virtual stage for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Ayush, and thank you so much for those incredible insights, Jen. With that, at every event, we like to thank our speaker with a poster, and today is no different. So the poster that we have today is made by our lovely communications member, Lily, and the poster has an illustration of Jen encircled with stars representing the Cherokee Nation flag, and was made by Lily once again. And after this event, we'll have Brian get your mailing address so we can send over a physical copy to you.
Thank you, Wado. That's very lovely. That's so great.
We're
Thank
so
you.
glad. Thank you so much for coming. And at every event, there's a lot of work that goes behind them. So we'd like to just recognize our event manager for the night, Brian Kim, our poster designer, Lily, our lovely communications lead, Dixie, our technology lead, Ellie, and of course, our moderator, Ayush. And our next event is a panel on science communication, which will be Monday on April 25th at 5 p.m. on Facebook Live. And thank you so much, everybody, for coming to our event. If you have any feedback for us, please feel free to use our feedback form at tinyurl.com/forum feedback SP22. And for more events, please feel free to like us on Facebook, and to stay updated on what we're doing, please also visit our website. Also, if you have the means to do so and would like to help us in support hosting free events for the public, please donate to our Venmo if you can. And with that, I'd like to say I hope everybody has a lovely evening. And I'd like to thank Jen once again for coming and for such a great event. And with that, everyone have a great